The Jedi called themselves guardians of peace and justice. That sounds noble and inspiring until you actually look at what they did. Because if you dig beneath the robes and the rhetoric, the Jedi did not look like monks. They looked like crusaders. From the Clone Wars to centuries of galactic conflicts, they were always in the middle of battle. They preached about balance but marched at the head of armies. They told the galaxy they were neutral, but toppled governments whenever it suited their definition of peace. That is not guardianship, that is conquest dressed up as morality. The more you study the Jedi, the more you see how their wars looked less like defense and more like holy missions. Enemies were branded as heretics, systems were devastated in the name of order, and the line between peacekeeping and crusading vanished completely. They were not guardians, they were zealots with sabers. And the wildest part is how blind they were to it. They really believed they were noble, that every war was justified, every intervention moral. But from the outside, the galaxy saw them for what they were. Warriors of faith pretending to be arbiters of balance. This hypocrisy is why the Jedi were so easy to destroy. The galaxy was tired of holy wars being waged in the name of peace. Palpatine did not just kill the Jedi, he exposed them. And once their myth collapsed, there was nothing left to protect them. In this video, we are going to break down why the Jedi did not keep peace, how they actually waged holy war, and why their hypocrisy doomed them from the very start. The Jedi love to call themselves guardians of peace and justice. That is their tagline, their mission statement, the phrase they repeat to senators, children and themselves whenever they need to feel righteous. But if you actually watch their history in action, it does not look like peace at all. It looks like war. From the moment we see them in The Phantom Menace, they are not mediators but negotiators, backed by lightsabers. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan arrive on Naboo, supposedly as diplomats, but are immediately prepared to fight. That sets the tone for what the Jedi really are, soldiers pretending to be monks. The Clone Wars makes this hypocrisy impossible to ignore. The Jedi accept the clone army without hesitation and then place themselves at the very front of the war effort. They are not reluctant generals. They are enthusiastic ones. Yoda gives rousing speeches about fighting for peace. Mace Windu sits in the War Council, and Obi-Wan leads fleets across the galaxy. This is not guardianship, this is military command. If you strip away the robes and the philosophy, they are indistinguishable from any other group of warrior leaders. The Jedi Temple might as well have been a pentagon with stained glass windows. And when you think about the clones themselves, it becomes even worse. These men were bred only to die in a war the Jedi did not even question. They never asked who commissioned the army or why it appeared at the exact moment they needed it. They simply took command and marched legions into battle. That is not peacekeeping, that is crusading. And it reveals the rot at the core of their philosophy. They said they defended life but treated soldiers as disposable extensions of their will. A holy war requires holy warriors, and that is exactly what they became. Look at the way the Jedi treated dissent during this period. Anyone who questioned them was seen as a threat to the Republic. Count Dooku is an interesting example, because before he became a Sith, he was simply a Jedi who walked away from the Order and its politics. His departure was framed as dangerous heresy, not legitimate criticism. That tells you everything. To the Jedi, if you were not with them, you were against them. They may not have called themselves crusaders, but their dogma created the same divide, the righteous versus the wicked. This even bleeds into how they handled planets caught in the crossfire. Entire worlds were devastated because the Jedi prioritized victory over diplomacy. Think about Ryloth, Geonosis, and Umbara. The Jedi marched troops onto foreign soil, destroyed infrastructure, and toppled governments while insisting they were liberators. How different is that from any empire enforcing its worldview through conquest? The only difference is the Jedi waved a banner called peace while doing it. And the Republic enabled all of it because the Jedi gave them moral cover. Senators could vote for war, knowing that robed mystics were leading the charge. The Jedi legitimized violence by branding it necessary. That is how holy wars always work. You frame violence as the only path to salvation. In this case, salvation meant democracy, the Republic, and of course the Jedi Order itself. The Sith understood this hypocrisy better than anyone. Palpatine in particular exploited it perfectly. He knew that once the Jedi put themselves at the head of an army, their image as peacekeepers would collapse. The public would see them as warmongers, not sages. And when the time came to brand them as traitors, few people questioned it. Because after years of watching Jedi lead legions into battle, the leap from general to usurper did not feel so far-fetched. By the end of the Clone Wars, the Jedi had lost the very thing they claimed to stand for. They were not symbols of peace, but symbols of war. They were not guardians of life, but commanders of death. And the tragedy is they could not even see it. They were so locked into their own narrative that they thought their actions were noble. But from the outside, the galaxy saw what they really were. Holy warriors on a never-ending crusade. Now let us zoom out from the Clone Wars, because this pattern is not unique to that era. For centuries, the Jedi were constantly intervening in galactic affairs under the guise of keeping peace. Whenever there was a planetary conflict, a border dispute, or a political crisis, the Jedi were sent in. But they never came as neutral arbiters. They came as representatives of the Republic, armed with lightsabers and dogma. That means every negotiation was already slanted before it began. The Jedi were not above politics, they were politics. Take the Jedi involvement in Mandalore during the Old Republic. They justified military campaigns against the Mandalorians as defense of peace. But from the Mandalorian perspective, the Jedi were invaders enforcing their will. The very existence of the Mandalorian Wars shows how far the Jedi were willing to go in prosecuting a holy conflict against those they deemed dangerous. And the fallout from that war gave rise to Revan Malak and countless Sith, all sparked by Jedi insisting they were fighting for balance. In reality, they were fueling centuries of instability. Even in peacetime, the Jedi inserted themselves into every corner of galactic governance. They claimed detachment but served as generals' ambassadors and sometimes executioners depending on what the Senate needed. That is not detachment, that is political entanglement. Their supposed neutrality was an illusion, and when they sat on high councils dictating which leaders were legitimate and which were not, they looked less like monks and more like theocrats. Their relationship with the Force also plays into this. They interpreted the Force as a moral compass that conveniently aligned with their own decisions. But if the Force is truly neutral, as we discussed in other contexts, then what the Jedi were really doing was weaponizing mysticism to justify conquest. That is the definition of a holy war. You claim divine backing for every choice and dismiss anyone who disagrees as misguided or evil. The Jedi were masters of this. Consider their relationship with the Sith. Instead of treating them as political or philosophical rivals, they turned them into existential threats. The language was absolute. Sith must be destroyed. Balance must be restored. Darkness must be purged. That is not the language of peace. It is the language of religious warfare. You cannot compromise with someone you have declared inherently evil. And by framing the conflict this way, the Jedi ensured eternal war. A war they could always justify because it was never about territory. It was about morality. And morality wars never end. That is why the Jedi Order kept fighting conflict after conflict. They needed the war to maintain their identity. Without Sith to oppose, without enemies to brand as threats to peace, what purpose did they serve? You can see the cracks of this in the prequels. When the Jedi sit in the council chamber and worry about diminishing influence, it shows that they tied their worth not to peace, but to conflict. Guardians who have no one to guard against start to feel irrelevant. This mindset is also what blinded them to Palpatine. They were so convinced that they were holy warriors that they could not imagine the Sith winning in plain sight. Their arrogance was born out of centuries of thinking they were chosen vessels of the Force. By the time Palpatine revealed himself, it was already too late. The Jedi were entrenched in a mindset that made them incapable of seeing reality. The Jedi's fall was not a sudden tragedy. It was the inevitable consequence of centuries of holy war disguised as peacekeeping. They had spent too long branding themselves as the galaxy's moral police. And when the galaxy finally lost faith in their crusade, it was not just the end of the Order, it was the end of their myth. What makes all of this even more fascinating is how the Jedi are still framed by Star Wars itself. In the original trilogy, they are mythologized as noble knights cut down by tyranny. Obi-Wan and Yoda described the Jedi as symbols of justice, victims of a galaxy gone wrong. But when you dig into the history, especially with the prequels and the Clone Wars, you see a much darker truth. They were not cut down because they were too good for the world. They were cut down because they lost their way and turned peace into war. The irony is that their destruction at the hands of Palpatine was framed as evil, but it was also inevitable. He did not just wipe out a noble order. He dismantled an institution that had already transformed into warriors of dogma. He twisted their holy war against them and used their hypocrisy as justification. And the galaxy let it happen because it was tired of Jedi brandishing sabers in the name of morality. This reframes characters like Anakin Skywalker too. His fall's often seen as a personal tragedy. But in another light, it is the natural outcome of a system that raised warriors rather than people. He was indoctrinated from childhood into a holy war mentality. When Palpatine offered him power and purpose, it was not a corruption from outside. It was an extension of the very crusader mindset the Jedi had already planted in him. The difference was that Palpatine promised victory instead of endless battles. And when we look at Luke Skywalker, we see the same tension. Yoda tells him that Jedi must confront Vader, that Jedi must face the dark side. There is always a war to be fought, always an enemy to be purged. Luke nearly falls into the same holy war cycle until he breaks it in Return of the Jedi by refusing to kill his father. That act of compassion, not conquest, is what saves him. Ironically, it is the one moment when a Jedi actually lives up to their supposed ideals. This is why the Jedi legacy is so complicated. Fans want to see them as heroes, and in many ways they are. But heroes who wage endless wars in the name of peace are not heroes at all. They are zealots with lightsabers. And when you put it in those terms, then the entire saga becomes less about good versus evil, and more about the danger of dogma on both sides. The Jedi's hypocrisy also has a chilling modern parallel. Whenever an institution claims moral superiority while waging wars in the name of peace, people eventually see through it. Empires collapse, religions fracture, and orders fall. The Jedi are a fantasy reflection of that truth. Their failure is not just about Order 66. It is about centuries of trying to enforce a vision of peace that always required violence to sustain. So when Star Wars presents the Jedi as tragic martyrs, it is worth remembering what really happened. They lost because they stopped keeping peace and started waging holy war. They lost because they confused their own survival with the survival of the galaxy. And they lost because when you fight forever, you forget what peace even looks like. The lesson is not that peace is impossible. It is that peace cannot be imposed by warriors who only know how to fight. The Jedi never understood that. And that is why their end was not just tragic. It was deserved.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.